Okay, so right off the bat, I apologize for the title and thumbnail of this video. Your combat encounters are not boring. Let's get that right out of the way. You are amazing for being the dungeon master or the game master for your group, and the fact that you're doing this and creating worlds and creating these amazing immersive experiences for your friends is a miracle. You're one of very few people that are willing to do this, and I want to applaud you for doing that. With that said, backtracking. With that said, I want to give you guys some strategies in order to make your combat encounters that much cooler, because there's plenty of things that we can do as dungeon masters and game masters to make our combat encounters just a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more enriching, as opposed to the typical slugfest back and forth, which in certain cases is appropriate, especially when when your player characters are fighting a huge monster with a huge stack of hit points. However, there are some really interesting ways we can make our combat encounters that much more dynamic and fulfilling, and will make you as the dungeon master look like a genius. Your players will love it, and it'll be fun for you to run. So without further ado, let's actually jump into ways we can make our combat encounters just a little bit cooler. What's going on, guys? My name is Howard, or Howie. This is the Blue Collar DM YouTube channel, the channel dedicated to breaking down those barriers for new players and dungeon masters alike. I actually stream Monday, Wednesday, Friday on Twitch. Link for that Twitch stream is going to be down in that description below. There we talk about how to make combat encounters interesting, how to make dynamic role-playing decisions and choices as player characters, or as dungeon masters, or world building, campaign prep, but then we also talk about how to utilize different virtual tabletop softwares and stuff like that. So any questions you guys have, I'm there as a resource for you. Again, link for that down in the description below. But let's get to the point of this video. Let's talk about how to make our combat encounters just a little bit more interesting. So I like to break it down to 3 different categories of different aspects we can add to our encounters to make them interesting. And those are going to be the environment, the events, and of course, the monsters. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to break down those different actual categories, and we're going to actually give them different dynamic kind of interesting aspects in order to make them just a little bit different. So first we're going to talk about is environment. So there's a lot of different ways we can actually change and alter the environment in order to make it just a little bit cooler. So one thing we like to do, or at least I like to do, is I like to make weather, or consider the weather as part of my combat encounter. Now, this can be impacted greatly depending on if you're going to be in a cave system or something like that, but it can also, the weather can be changing in the cave as well. Think of it as maybe there's fog in the cave that rolls in and makes it really difficult to see for the monsters and for the player characters. Maybe if you're outside, it's raining, maybe it's a lightning storm, maybe lightning is hitting the ground and might hit one of the monsters or one of the player characters. Just different kind of interesting dynamic ways that you can kind of play off of that. And then also, like, whether or not there's sunlight or not. There are some monsters that are sensitive to sunlight, and the drow, as well as a player character race, are also sensitive to sunlight. So just different kind of things you can play around with to kind of make the weather of your environment a little bit more dynamic, so that way the player characters have to think a little bit. It's also fun to actually add music and ambiance sounds to your kind of playlist that you utilize for some of these combat encounters. One way you can do that is that there's some software out there called Sirenscape. There's a bunch of other different ones. I'll leave links down there for different ways you can do that. Tabletop Audio's got some stuff, but you can actually use some of your music to kind of create that kind of environment and that kind of ambiance. And if it's raining, you can simulate that rain effect. If it's a lightning storm, you can simulate that. Maybe there's snow in your encounter and the player characters are running across snow, and as they run, it goes scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. But maybe there's something under the snow that they step on or something. You get the idea. You can make it a little bit more fun just by adding a little bit of weather into the environment. Another way we can make our environment a little bit interesting is also by creating obstacles. So this could be something as simple as maybe there's a table in the middle of the ground, or in the middle of the tavern, let's say, and the player characters have to kind of, maybe they think they need to run around the table, maybe they want to run across the table, maybe they want to run under, slide under, baseball slide, or maybe they just manipulate the environment by moving it out of the way, or whatever the case may be. Maybe there's some stalagmites or stalactites. I'm always confused, probably the same way Mercer is, by which one's which. But basically those rock structures that are coming up out of the ground or out of the ceiling that make it so the player characters have to walk around them. Maybe it's a way they can utilize something for cover. Maybe there's a stone wall they can hide behind for cover if they're a rogue, or any other player character. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of play around with just adding a little bit of interesting obstacles to the terrain. The other way we can actually play around with that is also we can create, maybe there's a fire or a campfire, maybe there's flowing water in the way, and maybe that creates some difficult terrain for the player characters to run through. Maybe there's mud that makes them difficult to run through. This all still applies to the monsters, of course, but it creates a little bit more interesting dynamic as opposed to just like you're fighting in an open field and you can move wherever you want. So because it gives you kind of like something to play with. The other thing we can do with the environment, especially if we have like maybe some dragons or something like that that are in their own lair, maybe we give the actual terrain itself layer actions. Like maybe there's a gout of fire that spurts up out of the ground every time it comes to initiative to roll 20, and that impacts our encounter. Maybe we make the terrain malleable. Maybe the player character's kind of like with that example with the table, but maybe there's barrels or something like that the players can roll into the way. Maybe there's a boulder that they want to push into the actual monster itself. Maybe we want to hit the monster off of a cliff or something like that into the ground below. There's a bunch of different ways you can actually play around with the environment and make it and be able to manipulate it as the player character or as the dungeon master of the monsters to just make it a little bit cooler. One way I also like to give the players that agency to be able to play around with it is to also have the monsters do something with the environment that kind of gives the players, oh, we can actually do something with this. We can actually play around with it and move it ourselves. We don't have to just like, it's not like we're on a static battlefield on like a video game that like you can't do anything with it. That's always fun. Like maybe the monster puts out a campfire so that way they don't have to run through it. Or maybe there's, I'm trying to think of a better example. Maybe the monsters like have the access to spellcast and they freeze the water that's flowing in the middle of the combat and they run across it. Something along those lines, just to kind of give a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more fun to the environment itself. With that said, let's jump into events. So there's a lot of different ways we can actually add events to our combat encounters to make the encounter itself just a little bit different and again, a little bit more dynamic and interesting. One great way to do this is just an explosion. Seems kind of silly, but you can actually just, anytime there's an explosion in the encounter or something like that, and some sort of event that kind of maybe changes the battlefield as a result, is a lot of fun. Maybe the explosion is actually NPC coming into the fight, realizing that, or trying to come into the fight to help the players out or something like that. And that requires a little bit of a, how do you want to say, preparation and stuff like that on yourself as the dungeon master to understand like when to utilize this kind of thing, because you don't always want to have NPCs coming in to save the player characters all the time. But that again is another event, whether it be the explosion or the explosion bringing other people in, or just having other NPCs come in to aid the characters can be a huge thing. Another event that could happen is maybe there's aid to the monsters that comes. So maybe the player characters are dealing with a small group of goblins or something like that, and then maybe more goblins hear what's going on and they come in and they come to try to help out their comrades, something like that. That's another event that can happen. Maybe the terrain changes. Now some of these are going to be related to each other, which kind of makes sense, but maybe the terrain changes. Maybe all of a sudden a chasm opens up if you're fighting in the Nine Hells. Maybe like the ground shifts. Maybe there's an earthquake. Maybe there's something weird that happens that causes the terrain to shift. A good example of this would be if you've ever watched the Campaign 1 finale of Critical Role. The campaign, in that campaign, the terrain itself that they're fighting on shifts and changes. Now granted, this is a layer action typically, the way that they have it set up there. But it just gives you an idea of like how the terrain can be moved based on certain events that happen that kind of change things up a little bit. Another way is to actually make a time component. And what do I mean by this? There's a lot of different ways you can make it so you can make time important. So maybe the player characters are trying to escape a crumbling cave or something like that, and they've got to fight these monsters that are blocking their path really fast and get past them so they can continue to run out before they get crushed by the cave falling in on itself. Maybe the player characters are trying to get to an NPC and save them because they're being attacked or something like that, and they were tasked to protect them. They've got to get through these goons that are kind of blocking their way and try to get there. Or maybe there's a ticking explosion about to happen in the chasm and they need to wipe everything out of the way so they can grab an item and then get out of there as fast as possible, or else they themselves are encapsulated by that explosion. There's a lot of different ways you can make time important, but one thing you want to do, especially if time is an important aspect of the encounter, you want to make your player characters come up with their decisions on the fly really fast. You don't want them to be thinking too long and give them too long to make their decisions, because then time isn't important anymore. It just feels like it's I mean, granted, your time technically takes 6 seconds, but you want the player characters to feel like they have to move quickly. So making them make decisions faster, the more decisions they make in a specific time frame, the more actions they can take, something like that. It makes it much more dynamic, and then you as the dungeon master have to do the same thing for your monsters. The monsters have to move quickly. They have to make their decisions really fast and on the fly. Maybe they'll do something that they normally wouldn't do because they're under that time clock pressure and trying to keep the player characters in the space or whatever like that, depending on if they're willing to self-sacrifice themselves, or maybe they want to get out themselves as well, but they're tasked with taking out the player characters first. So kind of keep that in mind as you're kind of manipulating your encounters to just make them a little bit more dynamic. And then finally, the last way that we, as Dungeon Masters, can make our campaign encounter, or excuse me, my combat encounters, excuse me. Obviously, this is all taken in one take because I want this to be valuable, so I'm not going to bounce this around. But the other way we can make our combat encounters more interesting is based on the monsters we use. So we've kind of talked about it a little bit, again, with events. So, for example, if we have our monsters come in waves, that would be aid to the other monsters that are already there, but maybe the player characters take out the last one and then another wave of these goblins come in, or a wave of these kobolds, or steam mephits or something like that come into the fight. Or maybe we have a army kind of encroaching on us and we're trying to take out the leader before the rest of the oncoming army comes, and like some of them trickle in and we have to take care of them before we can run away. Other different things like that to kind of make the numbers game a little bit different, but it also challenge your players too, because under normal circumstances, if say you take a party of 4 players, and we'll actually jump over the computer as an example just to give you guys an idea. So maybe we have a party of level 4 players, and let's say they're fighting a bunch of bandits. So and this is Kobold Fight Club. I like using them. They're good to kind of come up with ways to make your CR and balanced encounters and stuff like that. But let's say that we have a bandit camp of like 40 bandits. Obviously, this is going to be deadly for a party of 4 at level 4. But maybe at the start, they're only fighting 5. And they get through those 5, but then more bandits come, and then they have to fight 8 more. And then more bandits come, and then they have to fight 12 more. So you can see, like, we're still utilizing a lot of our daily budget, but it's in a much more manageable way, and makes it so the player characters feel challenged because they don't get any rest. They have to continue to kind of fight these waves to stop them. Or bandits, probably not a great example, but maybe we use skeletons. Skeletons are one that obviously come in waves, I say obviously, are things that come in waves all the time. So that's one, excuse me. That's one way we can actually make the combat encounter interesting, by adding more skeletons. Maybe they have 6, and then maybe there's 12 that come, and then maybe 8 more come, 5 more come, or something like that. Just giving waves and dynamic, because undead just continue to come in waves because they just are attracted to sound. Maybe that's the way we kind of make the combat interesting with waves. Another thing that we can do is utilize monsters that make sense. So we're actually probably going to be over here for a majority of the rest of the video, because there's a great way to actually, this is a great way to make encounters a little bit more fun by just kind of playing around in here. So let's use monsters that make sense, or maybe monsters that don't make sense. And what I mean by that is there's first the environment. So I know we talked about environment before, but we're coming back and circling the wagon again. So let's say we want to use monsters that are in an aquatic setting. We want to find monsters that typically swim. So we've got crabs, and we've got dolphins and chul and aboleths, stuff like that. Maybe with the crocodile, it doesn't make much sense because usually crocodiles are going to be in swampy areas. So maybe we don't use that, but maybe we use something like a crab, or giant crabs, or maybe a giant seahorse, depending on what's going on, or a giant shark, or maybe a sea hag, something along those lines. Something that makes sense for the environment that we're fighting in. And you can utilize Kobold Fight Club to help you with that. So like say if it's in grassland, you have axe beaks and baboons. Maybe you have a mountain and you need bandits, a basilisk or something like that. Or maybe a dragon. So different kind of settings and environments will also inform you on what monsters to use. With that said, monsters that make sense or don't make sense is fun to play with. So say we are in let's say we're in a grassland area, and let's say we have some goblins. Goblins would make sense in a grassland area because there's always a bunch of them around. They live they live pretty much everywhere they want to be. They can live pretty much anywhere. But let's say we have some goblins. That's a good way to kind of make characters that make sense for the environment. And maybe they're working with some hobgoblins, because hobgoblins typically have reign and influence over goblins themselves, usually, and other goblin kin. But let's try to find something that could be a little bit different. So let's get rid of this gob part, and let's say that they actually are, what could be fun? Maybe they have a way that they've trained an Ankylosaurus, and that could be kind of fun for the player characters to interact with and kind of figure out, like, well, why do these goblins have dinosaurs? That doesn't make any sense. Well, maybe these goblins have trained and domesticated a dinosaur in order to be able to work for them and stuff like that. Or maybe we have some goblins that have, let's see if we can find, maybe there's a Black Earth priest or something like that that's kind of got stake in the goblin community. Or maybe you can find a way to make a player or a story arc that shows you why these goblins are working for this priest. Maybe they're being mind controlled. Maybe they see the priest as a method of helping them survive in the environment. A lot of different ways you can play around with this. The other thing I want to show you guys, and I think what we're going to do is we're actually going to jump into, let's jump into Roll20, just as an example. And while that loads, one of the things that I want to talk about is actually giving monsters weaknesses and resistances. So a lot of monsters that we have in the Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, basic rules, all that kind of stuff, they don't really have a lot of interesting dynamics to them. So one of the ones that actually does have a lot of interesting kind of things about it is the Troll. Mainly because, as you can see, the Troll has this regeneration where if they don't take acid or fire damage, they get to regenerate. And the only way you can kill them is if they start their turn with 0 hit points and they can't regenerate. So that's one way you can make your monsters fun. But another way we can make them fun, I'm hoping that we have the Remoraz in here, and if we don't, that's okay. Yeah, we do. Okay. So the Remoraz itself has some immunities. It's got immunities to cold and fire, which, you know, makes sense because they're a worm that lives in an icy area and they have a heated body. They have this heated body ability where they do fire damage to people. But what's a way that our player characters can kind of have an up on this? So I like to add weaknesses to my monsters just so that way the player characters try some different things. Maybe the Remoraz is going to be weak to lightning damage, and that's some way that they can actually take advantage of it, especially if your player characters have specific spells that they like to use a lot. Like say if you have a character that likes to use Frostbite, or if they have Ray of Frost, for example. Let's say we find a monster that's made of fire, so maybe like a Magma Mephit. I'm hoping the Magma Mephit's in here. We'll see. Yep, it is in here. So let's say we have a Magma Mephit, and it doesn't have, oh, it does have a vulnerability to cold, but that's a good example. Like maybe we take some fire-based monsters and actually give them vulnerability. So it requires a little bit of understanding of homebrew, which I know for some dungeon masters can be intimidating, but just adding like one little vulnerability can actually make the combat more interesting for your players, because then they're gonna be like, oh, what can we do to make this encounter easier? Or maybe we have like something like I'm trying to think of what we have in our monster manual in here for the basic rules, because I always do this live because I'd rather you guys have this kind of organic experience. But maybe we have a green dragon. Green dragon's a great example. So we have a green dragon here. He's got immunities to poison in the poison condition, but he doesn't have any weaknesses. But maybe we should add something to it to make him a little bit more dynamic. Maybe in this case, maybe he's weak to, let's try to think of something that makes sense. Fire can make sense because maybe it burns away the poison inside of him, or maybe we think of psychic damage because we're able to kind of influence. I'm very much utilizing apparently Pokemon resistances and weaknesses apparently in this video, but just gives you an idea of kind of like what you can use and actually add some things so that way maybe, yes, this is a CR15 encounter, but maybe our player characters of a party made up of 10th level characters can take on this adult green dragon because they have that ability, because they can actually figure out and maybe learn prior to the encounter what this dragon is weak to, or whatever other monster is weak to. So that's a way we can kind of play around with the monster to make it a little interesting. Now, the other thing I want to do is, as far as monsters is concerned, I want to talk about giving our monsters, additional actions. So Matt Colville does a very good job of this, explaining this, and I'll leave a link below, but I'll give you guys just a general overview as an example. So let's take our goblins that we had before. And, not the proficiency in the goblin language, but let's take our goblin that we had before. And right now they just have a scimitar and a short bow. Okay, so let's say we have a goblin boss. Now there isn't one here in the 5th edition SRD that we can pull from. But let's say we want to homebrew a goblin to make it more interesting and more dynamic. One way we can do this, in addition to having all these, is that maybe this is the goblin boss. He's a little bit tougher. He's got some more hit points, etc., etc. But maybe we give him some actionable things he can do on his turn. Maybe he has a bonus action where we can call in more of his comrades and just say, hey, we need support in here. And then another wave of goblins come in. But the goblin himself is the one that elicited that. Now, maybe you limit this to maybe like once or twice a combat because there's not going to be an endless supply of goblins necessarily, but that's something you can do. Maybe he has a reaction. And again, a lot of these are from Matt Colville's videos, so check that out. I'm paraphrasing a lot, but maybe when a goblin of his goes down, he goes, hey, you die when I say so. And he jumps back up and has 1 hit point based on maybe a constitution save or something like that to see if he can come back up. So there's a lot of different ways we can kind of play with our monsters too to homebrew them. Now, and like I said, check out Matt Colville's video. I'll give you a second to go back there. Okay, now that you're back, we can actually play around with these monsters, and give them actions in addition to what they already have in their stat blocks. Now, it's tricky to do this. You typically, or in my opinion, you typically want to take monsters that don't necessarily have these already. So for example, our bandit, all he has is attacks. Or maybe we say take our bandit captain. Our bandit captain has parry, so that's a really interesting reaction that he can have. But then he doesn't really have anything else. Like, he can't actually do anything on his bonus action, which, unless they're counting that the 2 attacks with the 2 range attacks with his dagger, or 2 with his scimitar and 1 with his dagger, the dagger being the bonus action attack, but maybe we take away that bonus action attack and give him something else, like, hey, we need support in here, or maybe he imbues his weapon with something, or maybe he is able to give himself advantage by doing some sort of action to help him out, like throw dust in his opponent's eyes or something like that, and he plays dirty. Just different kinds of ways we can manipulate our monsters to make them a little bit more dynamic, especially if you have a veteran play group who's used to, like, oh, it's another bandit captain. All right, well, I know he can parry, so I gotta really hit hard, and because he has parry and he can only do it in melee, well, I'll just attack him at range because he can't do anything about it. And all he can really do is throw daggers, and they're not really going to hurt me as much as his scimitar is going to do, and he can only attack twice, and I know this as a player character who's played D&D for a very long time, and I know the bandit stat block by heart as a result. Maybe we make him a little bit more challenging and a little bit more dynamic by adding some extra features to him to make him a little bit more interesting. And then that'll make your veteran players, or just even your vanilla, or did I say vanilla? Your green is what I meant to say, players, have a little bit more fun. So I guess what I'm trying to say here in general is that try to think about different ways you can make your encounters different than they usually are. A lot of us, including myself, will sometimes think of, all right, well, I'm in an Arctic environment and I need to come up with something. I'll just have my players fight a Remoraz in an open field or whatever, and that'll be enough for this encounter. Let's think about something a little bit different. Let's give that Remoraz some weaknesses and maybe put him up against a challenging situation for our players who maybe aren't as strong or strong enough to take it out inherently by themselves, but giving it a weakness, or maybe coming up with interesting ways to make it so that way the monster gets paralyzed as a result of something the players do, or causes some issues with the monster itself and its constitution, or something along those lines. Make our monsters more dynamic, make our environments more dynamic, and then also bring in some different cool, interesting events to happen that make the combat not just the typical vanilla, I hit, they hit, I hit, they hit. So with that said, if you guys have any questions, make sure you leave comments down there in the comment section. Again, that live stream is also a great place, Monday, Wednesday, Friday on Twitch. Link for that Twitch stream down in the description below. Starts at 9 p.m. Eastern time. It's a great way for me to also give you guys tailored advice to your specific situation, whether it be in addition to combat encounter building, just general world building as a dungeon master, or role-playing strategies as the dungeon master or players and stuff like that, ways you can make your role-playing a little bit better if you're looking for a more story-driven, immersive kind of game, or other different things. There's a whole lot that I can do for you guys if you come down there, so don't be shy. Come out there and ask those questions, and I'd be more than happy to answer them. I hope you guys learned something today. I hope you guys took some value out of this, because I know a lot of us are out there struggling to kind of find out ways we can kind of play around with this. Play around with your environments, play around with your monsters a little bit, make them a little bit more dynamic, and if you overshoot, that's okay, because as the dungeon master, you can change things as you go if you need to, and reel it back or reel it in, or maybe just give the monsters a little bit more to do. So have some thought, utilize your resources, play around with these different things, and I hope you guys learned something. I said it again. I hope you guys learned something today, and until next time, happy gaming.